Hello guys. If you're new to my channel, please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment letting me know how you felt about today's story. You can also suggest what kind of stories you'd like to see next on the channel. Now let's get started with today's story. 3 days before Thanksgiving, 68-year-old Margaret Wilson stood alone in her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning. The house was dark. Outside, cold November rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the smell of cinnamon, butter, roasted garlic, and fresh bread slowly filled the air. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and looked down at the handwritten list sitting on the counter. Every year she made the same list, every single Thanksgiving. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole, green bean casserole, homemade gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, apple pie, dinner rolls, mac and cheese for the grandkids. 18 people were coming. Children, grandchildren, cousins, neighbors, friends of the family, and Margaret planned every detail herself, just like she always had. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the mixing bowl. Arthritis had made cooking painful over the years. Standing too long made her knees swell. Her back burned constantly. But she never complained, not when it came to family. Family was everything to Margaret. Ever since her husband Richard passed away 9 years earlier, Thanksgiving had become even more important to her. It was the one day when the house felt alive again. The one day when laughter echoed through the hallways. The one day when she didn't feel so alone. She still remembered what Richard used to say every Thanksgiving morning. "Meg," he would smile, kissing her forehead, "people don't come here just for the food. They come because this house feels like love." And Margaret believed that. She believed every hour in the kitchen mattered. Every pie crust, every carefully folded napkin, every candle placed on the table, because love was hidden in small things. That's how she had lived her whole life. She raised her son Daniel that way. Daniel had been only 10 years old when Margaret worked double shifts at the diner after Richard lost his job years ago. She remembered coming home exhausted at midnight and still sewing Daniel's Halloween costume by hand because she couldn't afford to buy one. She remembered skipping meals so Daniel could have school lunch money. She remembered sitting beside his hospital bed all night when he had pneumonia at age 14. She remembered every sacrifice. And she would have done it all again, because mothers do that. They give, and give, and give, until sometimes there's almost nothing left. By Tuesday afternoon, Margaret's kitchen looked like a storm had passed through it. Flour covered the counters. Dirty bowls filled the sink. The turkey sat thawing in the refrigerator. Pumpkin pies cooled beside the window. Her feet hurt so badly she had to sit down every 20 minutes. Still, she kept going. Her daughter-in-law, Vanessa, walked into the kitchen while scrolling through her phone. "Wow," Vanessa said casually. "You're really doing the most again this year." Margaret smiled softly. "Well, everyone likes homemade food." Vanessa shrugged. "I guess, honestly, I would have just catered everything." Margaret laughed gently. "That's not really Thanksgiving to me." Vanessa didn't answer. She simply grabbed a bottle of water and walked away. Margaret watched her leave. There was always distance between them, not fighting. Not hatred, just distance. Vanessa was modern, busy, always online, always rushing. Margaret knew she probably seemed old-fashioned, but she still tried. She babysat whenever asked. She folded laundry, picked up the kids from school, cooked dinners when Vanessa worked late. She never wanted to be a burden. In fact, she tried very hard to be useful, maybe too hard. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and gray. Margaret woke up before sunrise. Again, she quietly moved through the kitchen while everyone else slept upstairs. The turkey went into the oven. Coffee brewed, rolls baked, potatoes boiled. Music from an old Frank Sinatra playlist played softly in the background. For a few peaceful moments, Margaret felt happy, truly happy. Because this was her purpose, or at least she thought it was. By noon, the house exploded with noise. The front door opened constantly. People carried coats inside. Kids ran through the hallway screaming. Football played loudly on television. Laughter filled every room, and Margaret stayed in the kitchen, alone, checking dishes, washing utensils, reheating gravy. Cutting pies. No one really noticed. Occasionally someone walked in and stole a bite of food. Smells amazing. You're the best, Margaret. This looks incredible. Then they disappeared back into the living room. Meanwhile, Margaret's body ached more every hour. At one point, she grabbed the counter because dizziness suddenly hit her. But she took a deep breath and kept moving. Dinner was almost ready. The table looked beautiful. Margaret had spent nearly an hour setting it. White candles, golden napkins, her favorite china plates, and in the center of the table sat a small framed picture of Richard, just like every year. Margaret smiled when she looked at it. "Still doing this without you," she whispered. Then she heard loud laughter coming from the living room. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward the hallway to call everyone for dinner. But before she entered the room, she stopped. Vanessa was sitting on the couch with her sister and two cousins, wine glasses in their hands, laughing. Then Vanessa said something that made the entire room burst out laughing. "Honestly, we don't even need hired help anymore." More laughter. Vanessa smirked. "We've basically got live-in staff." Someone asked. "Who?" Vanessa laughed harder. "Margaret, obviously. She cooks, cleans, babysits, folds laundry. Honestly, she does more than most nannies." The room exploded with laughter. One cousin added, "And she works for free." Another person laughed. "Oh my God, that's actually true." Margaret froze. The towel slipped slowly from her hand. For a second, she honestly thought maybe she heard wrong. Maybe it was a joke taken out of context. Maybe Daniel would say something. Maybe her son would stand up and defend her. Maybe he would say, "That's my mother." Show some respect. But Daniel only chuckled awkwardly while looking down at his phone. That hurt more than anything. Not the joke, not the laughter, not even the humiliation. It was the silence. Her own son's silence. Something inside Margaret cracked quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, like glass breaking underwater. No one noticed her standing there. No one noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. No one noticed the heartbreak on her face. Margaret slowly turned around and walked back into the kitchen. The sounds of laughter followed her down the hallway. She stood beside the sink for several long seconds, completely still. Then she looked around the kitchen. The food, the dishes, the candles. The table she had prepared with love. And suddenly she felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. For years she had convinced herself she was appreciated, needed, loved. But in that moment she realized something painful. They loved what she did, not who she was. There's a difference, a heartbreaking difference. Margaret quietly removed her apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the counter. Then she walked upstairs. No anger, no screaming, no confrontation, just silence. In her bedroom, she opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. The same suitcase she and Richard used during road trips decades ago. Her hands shook while packing. A few sweaters, medication, family photos, her Bible, and Richard's old flannel scarf. Downstairs, laughter continued. No one came looking for her. No one noticed. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Tears finally rolled down her cheeks. She looked around the room she had lived in for nearly 40 years. Every corner held memories. Daniel taking his first steps, Christmas mornings. Richard dancing with her in the hallway while music played. Family movie nights, birthday cakes, life, an entire life. And now somehow she felt invisible inside it. She quietly wrote a note. It simply said, "The food is ready. I hope one day you understand that mothers are human beings too, not servants. Happy Thanksgiving. Love, Mom." Margaret placed the note on the dining table beside Richard's photo. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked out the front door. No one stopped her. Outside, cold wind brushed against her face. The rain had stopped. The neighborhood glowed with warm holiday lights. Margaret placed her suitcase into the trunk of her old car. For a moment she hesitated. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. Part of her wanted to go back inside. Pretend she never heard the joke. Smile through the pain. Keep sacrificing. Keep shrinking herself. That's what mothers from her generation did. They endured, silently. But another part of her, a part buried for years beneath responsibility and guilt, whispered something different. You deserve dignity too. Margaret started the engine and drove away. Back inside the house, nearly 20 minutes passed before Vanessa finally said, Can someone get Margaret? I'm starving. Daniel walked toward the kitchen, then frowned. Mom, no answer. He checked upstairs. Nothing. The bedroom closet door hung open. The suitcase was gone. His stomach dropped. Vanessa, he called quietly. Everyone slowly gathered near the dining room. Then Daniel saw the note. Silence filled the house, the same house that had been loud with laughter only minutes earlier. Vanessa picked up the note with trembling hands. As she read it aloud, her voice cracked halfway through. Nobody spoke afterward. Nobody touched the food. Nobody looked at each other. For the first time all day, they noticed the details Margaret had spent days preparing. The folded napkins, the handwritten place cards, the warm rolls wrapped carefully in cloth, the candles. The tiny bowl of extra cranberry sauce Daniel loved since childhood. Everything had been done with love, and they had turned the woman behind it into a joke. Daniel slowly sat down in his chair, then covered his face with both hands, because suddenly memories came flooding back. His mother walking to work in snowstorms. His mother staying awake helping him with school projects. His mother cheering at every pause. The house never felt the same after Margaret left that night. Even after she returned weeks later, something had changed, not only inside the family, but inside Margaret herself. For the first time in nearly 40 years, she stopped waking up every morning thinking about everyone else before herself. And strangely, that made everyone uncomfortable, especially Vanessa. At first, Vanessa tried convincing herself the situation had been exaggerated. It was just a joke, she told herself repeatedly. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true anymore. Because jokes don't usually make people pack a suitcase and disappear. And guilt has a way of growing louder in silence. The weeks after Thanksgiving became painfully awkward. Margaret was polite, kind, respectful, but distant, very distant. She no longer rushed to fold laundry before Vanessa woke up. She no longer cleaned the kitchen after everyone slept. She no longer babysat automatically whenever asked. And for the first time ever, she started saying something the family had almost never heard from her before. No! At first it shocked everyone. One afternoon, Vanessa walked into the living room while getting ready for work. Margaret, can you pick up Aina from school today? Margaret looked up calmly from her book. No, sweetheart. I already made plans today. Vanessa blinked. Plans? Margaret never had plans. Her entire life had revolved around everyone else's schedules. Okay, Vanessa replied awkwardly. But irritation quietly rose inside her. Not because Margaret said no, but because Vanessa suddenly realized how much she had depended on her. And dependence often disguises itself as entitlement. Daniel noticed it too. For years, his mother had quietly carried the emotional and physical weight of the household without asking for recognition. Now the absence of her constant giving exposed how much everyone had taken for granted. The house became messier. The kids complained more. Laundry piled up. Dinner wasn't always ready. And suddenly, Vanessa felt overwhelmed. One evening she snapped while standing in the kitchen. I seriously don't understand how your mother did all this every single day. Daniel looked at her quietly, then said something that stayed in Vanessa's mind for weeks. Because she loved us more than we deserved. Silence filled the room. Vanessa didn't respond, because deep down she knew he was right. Meanwhile, Margaret slowly began rebuilding pieces of herself she had abandoned years earlier. Every Tuesday morning, she attended a small senior art class at the community center. She started gardening again. She joined a book club. Sometimes she even drove to the lake by herself and simply sat watching the water for hours. For the first time in decades, She allowed herself to exist outside of being needed, and it felt both beautiful and heartbreaking. One cold December afternoon, Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror brushing her hair when she suddenly realized something painful. She didn't actually know who she was anymore. Not completely. For years she had only been mom, grandma, the one who helps, the one who sacrifices. But somewhere along the way, Margaret disappeared. That realization made tears fill her eyes. Not dramatic tears, not loud sobbing. Just quiet grief for the woman she used to be, a woman with dreams, hobbies, energy, laughter. Richard used to tell her she had the brightest smile in every room. When was the last time she truly smiled like that? She couldn't remember. A few days before Christmas, Vanessa knocked softly on Margaret's bedroom door. Margaret looked up from her knitting. "Come in." Vanessa entered slowly, almost nervously. In her hands was a small box wrapped in silver paper. "I got this for you," she said quietly. Margaret looked surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Vanessa sat down carefully on the edge of the chair across from her. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa finally whispered, "I've been embarrassed to face you." Margaret stayed silent. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. "I keep replaying that night in my head." Her voice cracked. "The joke, the laughter, the way Daniel said nothing." She wiped her eyes quickly. "I didn't realize how cruel it sounded until you left." Margaret looked at her carefully, not angrily, just tired. Vanessa lowered her head. "My mother treated my grandmother the same way when I was growing up," she admitted quietly. "She always complained about taking care of her. Always acted like she was a burden." Margaret listened silently, and I think somewhere deep down I learned that behavior without realizing it. The room became very still. Vanessa finally looked up. "But that doesn't excuse what I did." Margaret stared at the wrapped gift in Vanessa's hands. Then softly asked, "What's in the box?" Vanessa gave a weak smile through tears. "Open it." Margaret slowly unwrapped the paper. Inside was a framed photograph. It was an old picture someone had taken years ago during Thanksgiving. Margaret stood in the kitchen laughing while holding a wooden spoon. Flour dusted her cheeks. Richard stood behind her smiling proudly. And Daniel, much younger then, hugged her around the waist. Margaret's lips trembled instantly. "I found it in an old album," Vanessa whispered. "I realized something when I saw it." Margaret looked at her. Vanessa's eyes overflowed now. "You weren't the help." Her voice broke completely. "You were the heart of this family." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Because sometimes the words we wait years to hear arrive after the damage is already done. And somehow that makes them both comforting and painful at the same time. Vanessa finally broke down crying. "I'm so sorry." Real sorrow, real shame, not performative guilt. Margaret slowly reached across the table and held her hand. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because carrying bitterness forever destroys the wounded person too. Christmas arrived quietly that year, smaller, softer, different, and maybe better. For the first time ever, everyone shared responsibilities. Daniel cooked breakfast. The grandchildren helped decorate cookies. Vanessa cleaned the kitchen without being asked. And Margaret rested. At one point, little Ana climbed into Margaret's lap beside the fireplace. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart. Why were you gone on Thanksgiving?" The room became silent instantly. Adults exchanged nervous glances. Margaret looked down at her granddaughter's innocent eyes. Children notice more than adults realize. She gently brushed hair from Ana's face. "Because Grandma was sad." Ana frowned. "Did someone hurt your feelings?" Margaret smiled sadly. "A little." The little girl thought quietly for a moment, then wrapped tiny arms around Margaret's neck. "Well, I love you." Margaret closed her eyes tightly as emotion rushed through her chest. Sometimes healing begins with the simplest words. Weeks later, Daniel found an old voicemail from his father saved on an ancient laptop. Richard's voice filled the room. "Take care of your mother, Danny. One day you'll realize nobody will ever love you the way she does." Daniel sat there crying for nearly an hour, because grief changes shape over time. Sometimes you don't fully understand love until you realize how close you came to losing it. Spring slowly arrived, and with it came changes nobody expected. Margaret started volunteering at the community center, teaching cooking classes to widows and elderly women. The classes became incredibly popular, not only because of the recipes, but because of Margaret herself. People felt warmth around her, safety, comfort. One afternoon after class, another elderly woman asked, "How do you stay so kind after everything life puts people through?" Margaret smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Because bitterness hardens the heart, and I don't want the people who hurt me to change who I am." The woman sitting beside her quietly wiped away tears. Margaret had no idea how many people needed to hear that. Months passed. Slowly, the family healed, not perfectly, but honestly, and honest healing matters more than pretending. Then Thanksgiving approached again, the anniversary of the night everything broke apart. Tension quietly returned to the house. Nobody knew how Margaret felt about it. Nobody knew whether she even wanted to celebrate this year. One evening, Daniel finally asked, "You don't have to host Thanksgiving again if you don't want to." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then surprised everyone by smiling softly. "I'd like to." Vanessa looked nervous. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." Then she added quietly, "But this time we do it differently." And they did. The next Thanksgiving morning looked nothing like the previous year. Nobody slept while Margaret worked alone. Instead, the kitchen filled with laughter from the beginning. Daniel burned the first batch of rolls. The grandkids accidentally dropped marshmallows all over the floor. Vanessa nearly ruined the gravy, and everyone laughed until tears filled their eyes. And Margaret sat in the middle of it all, watching something beautiful happen. Her family was finally learning that love is not one person sacrificing while everyone else consumes. Love is shared, carried together. That evening, as everyone gathered around the table, Daniel stood holding a glass again. But this time his voice was steadier. "1 year ago," he said quietly, "we almost lost the most important person in this family." The room became emotional instantly. Daniel looked at his mother. "I spent most of my life thinking love would always stay no matter how careless people became." His eyes filled with tears. "But love needs gratitude too." Nobody spoke. Even the children sat quietly. Daniel raised his glass toward Margaret. "To the woman who taught us forgiveness." Vanessa whispered softly, "And dignity." Margaret looked around the table. At her family, at the faces she loved, at the people who hurt her, and the people who changed. Then she noticed something that made tears rise quietly in her eyes. Nobody had left her alone in the kitchen all day. Not once. And suddenly she realized something powerful. Sometimes people don't understand your value until your absence forces them to feel it. Margaret smiled softly, a real smile, the kind Richard used to love. And for the first time in many years, the house didn't just feel full, it felt healed.